All right, perfect. So we'll send this out after the fact to everyone who kind of registered. Obviously, those of you who are able to join us today, you'll get to see this live, but in case you want to reference it after, you'll have access to that recording. Really appreciate everyone taking the time here today. We're excited to dive in. This is a topic that both Jason and I are probably overly passionate about and really excited to talk through. And where we're spending our time today is going to be all about how we adapt to change in 2023, but really all of these principles align going forward too. It's not just 2023, it's beyond, but specifically how we do that with what we refer to as dynamic strategic planning here at Elate. For those that don't know, at Elate, one of the things that we do is we get to build software that comes alongside organizations to help them with their strategic planning. Everything from the planning process all the way through how you execute on that plan and review, and then ultimately start that over again. We'll talk all about that cycle here today. All of that is something that we come alongside and enable people with our software. So if you're interested in learning more about that, feel free to reach out and let us know. But for today, we're going to be spending our time talking through, frankly, a lot of lessons learned that we have seen play out with a number of our different customers, and kind of setting the stage for how we think about planning going forward and why that's different than how we've thought about it in the past. So I'll go ahead and do a quick round of introductions for those that we haven't had the chance to meet yet. My name is Abby Parker. I'm the co-founder and COO here at Elate. I'm joined by JC Lichty. She is our Director of Customer Solutions. She oversees all things services, implementation, et cetera, with our customers. So she's certainly gotten to see a lot of this firsthand as well. And at the end of the day, both of us are really excited to be talking with you all here today, diving into, frankly, we're going to boil this down into kind of 8 ways that we believe dynamic planning can be your competitive advantage going forward. So we'll talk about that. For an agenda, really where we are focused on is starting with why are we talking about this, right? What are the challenges that we're seeing with traditional strategic planning? Why does that not, frankly, work anymore? It probably hasn't worked for the last 2 years, but why is that certainly not going to set us up for success going forward? Using that to dovetail into why dynamic planning matters. It's great if traditional strategic planning is broken, but what are we going to do about it? How can we think about this in a different way? And we'll spend the majority of our time here in this third phase around the 8 ways to move from traditional into dynamic planning, and end with how you can learn more for those of you who are interested. With that, we'll dive right in to the challenges with traditional strategic planning today. We talk about this quite a bit internally, but when we think about traditional planning, there are kind of 3 key milestones or kind of markers or symptoms of traditional planning. It's one, that it's built annually. It's then checked quarterly if you're lucky, and it is outdated quickly. We're going to come back to this. We're going to talk about rituals here later in the session, but for us, this was something we kept seeing time and time again with our customers that we were working with and prospects that we were talking with. You're spending all this time going into an offsite, creating this massive plan, and you have all this excitement coming out of the end of the year. A lot of you are probably in that process or wrapping up that process right now, and then you put it into motion, but you don't even come back and look at that until maybe once a quarter. And when you're doing that, there is so much that happens in the span of a quarter. Heck, there's so much that happens in the span of a week. But one of the things that we see time and time again is that when you're checking things quarterly, you're very, very reactive. And it's really hard to take into account the changes that are happening around us. With that, it very quickly becomes that your plan is out of date, right? You planned it for a year that maybe didn't pan out how you expected it to. I think all of us can relate to that over the past couple of years. There's been a lot that's come our way that we may or may not have planned for. And the reality is, as leaders of our business, we have to find a way to still be successful. And so rather than kind of having this traditional plan that you put up on a shelf and it's collecting some dust that you maybe bring out once or twice a year, we want this to be something where it becomes more iterative. Traditional planning is not meant to scale with your organizations. And so for us, when we think about navigating the ever-changing market conditions, the reality is that traditional planning just cannot keep up. This is our landscape today. Again, I think all of us can attest to that and have examples there. But for us, this is the reality of our situation. And so for us, it's all about how we can then dive into taking traditional planning and evolving that. When we think about kind of common signs here, again, these are the symptoms that we look for. But what these really mean for you and your business is that often your plans are very resistant to change. They're not often built with flexibility. They're very focused on really the tactical side of things. And when you're focused on the tactical side of things, you often spend time, as we're saying here, kind of spend time focusing on what we're doing versus where we are going. And so we're going to talk a lot about this in terms of outcomes and outputs here in a little bit. But for us, it's all about understanding not just what are the actions we need to take, but why are we taking those? We'll talk about the word why a lot. That's a huge component of dynamic planning. But then lastly, they are often reactive and unstable. And the biggest thing that we see here is that you see large swings and pivots in a business versus smaller course corrections. We'll talk about how you can make those because the reality is change is going to happen. If that's our landscape, then we as business leaders certainly need to be changing as well. But it's how do we change in an intentional way versus how do we just react to the latest thing that happened. Again, when we think about the market conditions that we're in now, we firmly believe that dynamic planning and evolving and taking the next steps into taking your traditional plan and evolving that going forward is a must-have. The reality is that the conditions that we're in are going to change whether we want them to or not. So it's about how do we make sure that we are setting ourselves and our businesses up for success going forward. That then inevitably begs the question of, well, what are we talking about here? When we talk about dynamic planning, we understand why traditional planning isn't working, but what are we talking about when we think about dynamic planning? And we really like to start by just defining what dynamic means. For us, when we think about something being dynamic, that is something that is characterized by constant change, activity, or progress. This probably sounds really familiar. It's the reality that a lot of us have been living in. And so one of the things that we really want to hone in on is that having a dynamic plan does not mean you don't have a plan. The opposite of traditional planning should not be like, great, let's just not plan at all, see how it goes. It's more about that we want to build that plan in a way that is going to assume volatility from the onset. We are assuming that, we are baking that in, and we are knowing that that's the reality. Since that is inevitable, we are building a plan in a way that is far more resilient to that. So we're going to get into the fun part here where we actually start to dive into these principles of dynamic planning. There's 8 different ones here. We're going to go through each one by one because they really do build upon each other. This is what we're going to be spending our time on today, but really quickly to kind of start at the onset here, when we think about dynamic planning, it has to unite every phase of the planning process. I mentioned this earlier, but it's not just about how you plan and create a plan, it's about how you then execute on that and review. That has to be a consistent theme throughout, and all these phases need to be connected and united. It needs to bring together the long-term vision with the tactical execution. So I mentioned that traditional plans often spend a lot of time just on the tactical. What are we doing? We want to make sure that we understand what we are doing is only important if we know why we are doing it and that it aligns to our longer-term goals. This ultimately is going to allow us to move faster. I think all of us are being asked to move faster right now. And we want to make sure that that speed is aligned to where we're going, because if you're moving faster in the wrong direction, you're not going to get where you want to go. We want to focus on the outcomes, not the outputs. I already mentioned this a little bit. We're going to dive into it deeper, but this is all about understanding the long-term direction of where you want to go. And we need to align organizations both vertically and horizontally. Vertically is often the one that we would recommend starting with if you're not aligned in any way today, but for us, it all has to be about how we align horizontally and cross-functionally as well. We'll certainly dive into that. Dynamic planning should be proactive, not reactive, right? So we need to be planning ahead. We need to understand that change is going to happen, and we want to get in front of it as things go off pace versus waiting for something to happen, waiting to the end of the quarter, addressing it, and then you've lost a lot of momentum. That in turn, that proactivity is what allows us to turn change into opportunity. It allows us to harness all the things going on around us and say, we are going to use that to our advantage. And that ultimately, when we do this well, dynamic planning as a whole becomes our competitive advantage. So we're going to go through these one by one over the course of our time today. If there are questions, thoughts, feedback on anything that we're saying, please drop those in the chat. We are happy to answer those. We'll save a little bit of time at the end as well, but there may be something that's coming top of mind as we're starting to share. So please feel free to drop those in. without further ado, we're going to dive into these 8 principles. I'll hand it over to JC to start, and we are excited to dive in.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Abby. So we are going to dive right into these 8 principles, starting with the first principle of dynamic planning, uniting every phase of the planning process. So Abby just started to talk about this as we think about planning, but also as we think about continuing to evolve that plan. So really, when we think about these phases, we like to break them up into 3 different phases of that cycle. 1, how we plan, how we execute, and then how we review. As we think about this first principle, we really want to move away from these 3 phases happening in silos or at one point in time and start to move from silos towards synergy, with all of these happening in a really cohesive and continuous life cycle. So before we talk through how to do this, let's talk about what this looks like in traditional strategic planning. So Abby started to talk about some of those common milestones, but we want to break it down as we think about this journey of how we get there. So really, you can see on the screen here, starting with setting that strategic vision with the CEO, with the visionaries at the company, understanding where we're going as an organization. Then moving into planning for the offsite, which I know this piece is where many of us on the call are likely at today, planning for that offsite, reserving the space, setting the agenda, knowing what we want to get out of that session, and then having that session itself, the strategic planning offsite. Abby and I like to say for this is where the magic happens in that offsite. Once we leave that offsite, we're then working through and presenting the plan to the board. We're starting to really see that waterfall effect where we're cascading that down. We're having it roll out to the different departments, and then we're getting that finalized. We're finalizing the budget, the operational plan, before we move to this purple pink phase of the timeline where we're launching it. We are going to the company, we have that kickoff, and we're saying, here's where we're going for this upcoming year. Now, what happens in traditional planning after we launch that is typically one of 2 things. 1, the cycle stops altogether. We set it and we really forget about it until the next year, until we come back and do it all again. This is where we like to say this goes to hide out in the PowerPoints. It goes on a shelf. It gets really dusty in the archives. And again, we really don't come back to that until we go to build our plan again annually. Now, if it doesn't stop, oftentimes we see that it discontinues for a few months, which is what Abby was walking us through as we think about coming back to that quarterly, where we're pulling it out of the archives, we're seeing how we're pacing. But here is again where we're being really reactive, and this is not able to scale with what we're doing. So for either of these scenarios, we know that this frequency is not enough. Our plans will become outdated really, really quickly. And when they're not at the forefront of our minds, what happens is other things start to take priority and become way more important. So let's take a look at what this looks like with dynamic planning. You will see as we switch to this slide, not much change, right? As we think about the beginning, it's fairly similar. But we get to that end of the timeline, that pink and purple phase where this starts to look a little different. You can see that a new bullet point has been added on this journey for establishing rituals. And this is us understanding how we're going to maintain it to ensure that this is living and breathing and evolving over time. So after we kick off and we launch it, if we kind of move forward here, we'll see that this circle is going to start spinning, because this is what these cycles and these phases start to look like. It's continuous and it's cohesive. And I think we talk about this all the time, but as we think about this journey and thinking about how we set the plan and launch it, that is really, really critical. But we would argue here at Elate that it is just as important to evolve our plan as we go. So let's talk about what makes this dynamic and how we can start to unite these 3 phases with some tactical examples. So as we move through this, again, we're going to move through how we plan, how we execute and review. One thing I'll call out here is that we are going to be defining these separately as they come up on the slide. But of course, these are going to continue to overlap. We talked about this earlier. We want to move from silos to synergy. So I'll call out this overlap as we go and start to define these. So the first one being how we plan, and not just how we plan in the beginning, but how we plan quarter after quarter. You can see here on the slide that there is a time duration noted. So planning 5 weeks prior to the next quarter. We have this time duration set apart, noting that this is going to be happening while we are still executing. So again, we start to see that overlap. Why this is important is that when we go to start to plan, when the next quarter starts, we are able to hit the ground running. So we're not losing momentum and time to execute because we're just starting to plan. So again, these start to overlap and we're constantly moving through and transitioning quarter over quarter. Along with that, as we're planning, we are building objectives that are connected. We're going to talk a lot about this of building relationships, but also prioritizing those areas that matter most. So those focus areas. This allows us to see that bigger picture, create the larger plan, and ultimately move faster as we start to move to that second phase of how we execute. So here, as we think about this phase of executing, this is where we're rolling out our plan. And really, we continue to do so in a phased approach. So starting with our mission and vision, and then continuing through that waterfall effect to ensure that what we're doing, our tactical execution, is aligned to our high-level strategy, which we're going to talk about here in a moment with that framework. But again, making sure we're doing so on that phased approach. The second piece of that, weekly status updates. We strongly recommend having objective owners provide an update on their status on a weekly basis, bi-weekly at a minimum, to allow us to really keep up with the rate of change that's happening. Abby mentioned this, but we know how much happens in 1 week. So the higher the frequency, the more proactive we can be with our plan. Speaking of frequency, this moves us right to that review phase. So while we're getting those status updates from objective owners, we're also reviewing those at the same frequency that we're providing those updates so that we can continue to reinforce those. Now, we talked about this in the plan phase, but how we set up our plan, so telling that bigger picture with the connected objectives, is what allows us to be proactive and leads us to understand that ripple effect. So when we're going into review, we can say, yes, now that this is at risk, I know what's going to happen, and we can set up action plans and mitigation plans to continue to be proactive. While we're reviewing weekly, we're closing out our objectives quarterly to, again, add that historical stamp, but allow that to guide us through the future quarters and what we need to do to continue hitting those plans that we set out annually. So as you can see here, as this circle kept moving, you can see that these are all happening in tandem. And this is what allows us to start to unify and unite that entire life cycle, which ultimately allows us to, again, be proactive, better forecast our plan so that when we go to start that cycle over again the next year, the time isn't spent looking in the rearview mirror or being surprised at what happened, because we were able to be proactive and take that action along the way. So with that, that leads us right into the second phase, or the second principle, which is dynamic planning brings together long-term vision with tactical execution. This step is all about making those connections and driving alignment. So Abby and I talk about this a lot with strategy and operation leader of how we connect where we're going and how we're going to get there. And what we find that there's oftentimes this proverbial bridge that's holding them together. And when we go and start peeling back all the layers of that bridge, we find that it's actually held together by things like many different PowerPoints, lots of manual spreadsheets, conversations that are happening in Slack and Teams and silos, and really what we like to refer to as being held together by that manual duct tape. And for those of you on the call, oftentimes this means a lot of manual work for you all. But really, as we think about employees, for them, this means a breakdown in visibility, clarity, and communication for them as they're working on their objectives. So for this second principle, we really want to eliminate this disconnect through dynamic planning, bringing everyone together through a framework. So that when we ask employees, they understand, hey, I know where we're going as a company, but more importantly, I know how the work I am doing fits into that puzzle piece. So let's talk about what this looks like as we pull up the framework. So you can see the framework here on the screen, and we have 3 different layers that we're going to walk through, really starting with that mission, vision, and values. So as we move forward here, you can see that we're starting to bring these together on the screen with examples, but really as we're rolling out this framework, before we just dive into everything, it is really important that everyone on the team has clarity around where we're going as an organization. So we know as we look at the middle here, that vision, that's something that doesn't change often, but it is so important as we're getting started that everyone clearly understands it, but also aligns with that mission and vision statement. We say this all the time, but who you are and where you're going as an organization matters more than just diving into a process. So once we have that rolled out, we then move to the second layer. And these are what we refer to as themes. They have so many different names: foundational pillars, rallying cries, North Star areas. But this layer is really, really important because this is what starts to help us make those connections and really put that bridge together. So again, where we're going with mission, vision, values, and our tactical execution, right in the middle, holding that together is these themes, which are really those categories of priorities. Oftentimes these fall into categories like revenue growth, company culture, product value, but really you can see here on the screen that these are not objectives and they are written intentionally, so they're not owned solely by one team. So what starts to happen as we have those objectives, we're able to start to draw these dotted lines to what themes we're supporting. So for you all across the organization, a lot of times we'll see, wow, we have 60% of our objectives supporting grow revenue by 3x, but maybe we have 4 or 5 supporting ones like best in class culture. So we're able to see how we're supported overall, but again, we really start to build out that vertical alignment, that waterfall effect before we move on to that cross-functional relationship. That final piece of that at the bottom, of course, we see those objectives, that tactical execution that is connected to the long-term strategy. These objectives are the high-level goals that we want to achieve. And as we dig into them, they will have the measurable metrics that we track to determine if we're successful. So we're going to dig into these of how we start to, again, connect them cross-functionally, that we can further unlock dynamic planning. But starting with this framework is what allows us to build that bridge with where we're going and how we're going to get there. This takes us right to the third principle of dynamic planning helps us move faster. So anytime we talk about this, I think the number one question that we get is, what do you mean by moving faster? Abby mentioned it earlier. We are constantly being asked to move faster. So what do we mean by that? And really what we mean here at Elate is getting alignment from the onset, so that when we go through our day-to-day and all these obstacles come up, we know how to pivot. I oftentimes describe this principle, if any of you have played arcade games, like the game of Whack-A-Mole, because this is oftentimes what things feel like every day in this ever-changing environment. I like to think of it as I'm working on an objective, then I get a Slack message with a new project that we want to take on, really like hitting again that game of Whack-A-Mole, like hop off a meeting and there's a brand new idea. All of these things are constantly happening with internally and externally as we think about change. And while that game, that arcade game, is fun for many, the word that I like to describe this is overwhelming. So when we think about dynamic planning, helping us move faster, the one thing I want to stress is that we are not saying that change is going to go away. Change is going to happen. It is inevitable. Urgent fires are going to pop up all the time, and we have to be ready. So dynamic planning is what allows us to have that clarity and be aligned on what to do when that happens. So before we go into more of the tactical of how do we do that? How do we prioritize this and start to pivot? I want to introduce you to a spectrum on the screen. And this is a spectrum of how organizations interact with change as it relates to their strategic plan. Like all spectrums, there are 2 ends of this spectrum. We're going to start first by looking on the left. The left-hand side of the spectrum is what we refer to as the set it and forget it side. This is where, again, we talked about this earlier, we set our annual plan, we pull it out of that dusty PowerPoint every once in a while, make sure we're still doing what we planned for that year, checking things off, but we're not adapting to the changing landscape of our world and environment. And really what we find is we're missing out on opportunities that are right in front of us. If I had to describe this left side in one word, it would be rigid. Now, let's go all the way to the other side of the spectrum, the right-hand side here, which we refer to as the wild, wild west. And this side of the spectrum is where we're constantly reacting to change. So we did create a plan, but every urgent fire that comes up, we react to, we pivot, we take on that new project, so much so that we lose sight of where we even wanted to go in the first place. Abby talks about this a lot, but when you're on this side of the spectrum, oftentimes you feel like you are spinning your wheels, but you are going nowhere. The right side of the spectrum, if we had to describe this one in one word, would be chaos. And like anything in life, we want to strive to find balance right in the middle with dynamic planning. And this is what allows individuals to seek autonomy through clarity. That is something we say here all the time, seeking autonomy through clarity. So what do we mean by that? This means setting the plan, but providing direction on where we're going and giving that permission and freedom to pivot and adjust as needed. And as needed is a really critical point to add in there, because we don't want to set ourselves up for the wild, wild west, but saying and accepting that things are going to change. And we as a team should feel empowered to have these conversations with that when that comes up around risks, blockers, opportunities that are right in front of us. And while this shouldn't be constant pivot and change, there are times where as a team, we're going to come to a consensus that we need to pivot. And if we do, we understand the implications and the impact from that. So how do we gain this clarity from the onsite? And part of this comes from prioritizing the work that we're aligning on. Not only is this about aligning to the strategy, so what we just went through, but also going through an activity of mapping where this falls on a matrix of value versus effort. So what you can see here on the right side of the screen. Now, Abby and I walked through this activity with organizations many times. And what we find that majority of the objectives that companies start to place on this grid as a collective team all start to fall into high value and high effort because everything's valuable and everything is important. But this activity allows us to see that we cannot take on all of these in the same quarter. So when we go through this activity, along with the framework and aligning to the strategy, this allows our team to focus on what is most important. From there, it allows us to deprioritize or reprioritize what we refer to as those not nows, things that may be worth doing, but again, not right now. Ultimately, this allows us to accomplish more meaningful work faster, and again, all be aligned. This is an activity that likely does happen during that planning phase, but what this does is starts to set us up and guide us in the future when new ideas pop up mid-quarter. So those urgent fires that we're referring to. So this allows us to, again, know where we're going, prioritize what's important, and start to block and tackle the rest so that we can move faster. So summing this all up, as we think about moving faster, dynamic planning allows us to avoid just running to all the urgent fires. When we do that, sacrificing the important. So this takes us right to principle number 4. We've created our objectives. We've prioritized what matters. Time for step 4, all about how do we measure it? And Abby started to talk about this earlier with dynamic planning focusing on the outcome versus the output, meaning we want to track the end result versus tracking the activity and ultimately making employees feel like they're just punching a time card for their objectives. So let's quickly define what this means before we go through how we do this in this exercise. And we'll do this by starting on the right with the outcome. And the outcome is what it is as a business you're trying to change or improve. These are things like value, impact, behavior, and ROI. I'd like to describe this on something that you can't necessarily get your hands on, but you can draw it on a graph. Now, moving our eyes to the left-hand side, the output, this is what feeds into the outcome. These are the action items, the tasks, the to-dos that help us get there. These are things that are oftentimes a result of an activity. Examples might be a new feature, a new slide deck, an epic, maybe the number of calls that are made. Outputs are something that you can get your hands on. It can usually be seen, felt, or moved about. Now, Abby and I talk about this quite a lot, and I think we'll be the first to admit that this is something that can be very difficult to articulate when we're building objectives. And it takes a lot of effort and enablement to move from being output focused to outcome oriented. However, there are many ways that we can set the stage and turn these into outcomes at the onset. So let's talk through how we do that. To do that, we're going to illustrate this story here. We're going to introduce you to Joe. Joe is a business development representative at your organization, and we are meeting with Joe in our quarterly one-on-one, looking at what his goals are and how he's going to measure it. Joe lets us know that he is going to be focused on making 100 calls this quarter. Great. What we notice right away is that the output, 100 calls, is focused on the result of an activity, something that is seen, that's moved about. What we're not focusing on is the impact that we're trying to make, that business value from those 100 calls. So as we're going through and we're meeting weekly, we're focusing on quantity versus quality. So as we're having these meetings and we're saying, great, Joe's pacing well, he's making all his calls. What we don't know is that while Joe's making 100 calls, our new business numbers aren't increasing at all. And because we're focusing on that number and that quantity, we miss out on the precious time and opportunity to course correct during that phase and during that quarter. So if you find yourself in this situation, how can we start to turn the outputs into outcomes? You can see here on the right-hand side, this activity, this kind of funnel that we walk through of asking yourself why around 5 times. Asking yourself the question, why? What is it you're trying to change or improve? From the times that we've done this, I will tell you that when you get to 3, 4, and 5 of asking yourself this is going to feel really frustrating, but a good exercise to ultimately get to what that outcome is. So you can see here on the screen, if we're working with Joe and saying, great, you want to make 100 calls, why? What is it you're trying to change or improve? Well, I'd really like to build pipeline. Why? What are we trying to change and improve? Moving to, we'd like 10 demos. Well, from there, we'd like 5 contracts sent until we ask ourselves that 4th or 5th time and say, well, what we really want is 100K in new business. So while we might be monitoring the number of calls that Joe is making, what we want to do is make sure we're marrying that with that outcome and monitoring that 100K in new business. So again, we are able to pivot as we need to throughout the quarter. This leads us right to number 5, which is how we begin to tell the full story with our plan. So we have talked a lot about vertical alignment and how we build that bridge with long-term vision and tactical execution. But one of the big keys to unlocking our plan is when we take this to the next level and start to align those objectives horizontally. Let's talk about why this matters. So if you look at this slide on the screen and look at the image on the right, likely the first thing that you will notice is, again, start to see all of these connections and say, hey, the work that we do in our department does not happen in a silo. And because of that, we need to have a holistic view across our plan and our business. When we start to define these relationships and build these connections, this allows us to do 4 things. 1, of course, it allows us to align that strategy with execution. So again, building that bridge and that connection, but it starts to illustrate that cross-departmental impact. Not only does this increase collaboration and communication, but it allows us to start to identify risks and blockers and opportunities. So if you can see here with this image as an example, we see launching new product on the right. Maybe we're heading into a meeting and say, hey, something has come up and this is at risk. We know that this is now a risk or blocker for us to increase new business to 1.2 million, and we can do something about it. So not only does it identify it, but it allows us to have proactive decision making so we can set those plans and continue moving forward. So as we start to build out these relationships, we will say this does not happen overnight. We like to take a crawl, walk, run approach to building out these relationships. Again, starting with those vertical relationships and connecting those, and then moving to that cross-departmental relationship. So if we take a look here on the screen, we're kind of going to walk through that framework of what this can start to look like with that crawl, walk, run approach. First one of setting our theme. So one of our themes being we want to grow revenue by 3x. As we head to the next layer, we can see for our company objective, our sales team says, great. In order to do that, I'm going to be increasing new business to 6 million. We have now formed a parent-child relationship. As we move down to that next phase, continuing on this waterfall effect, we can see that the SDR team says, great, we are going to develop Q2 pipeline of 12 million. You can see we've now built another parent-child relationship. What takes this to the next level is starting to build those cross-functional relationships. So you can see, again, the SDR wants to build that pipeline, but you can see that for their HR team, they're going to be hiring 3 new SDRs. The product team is going to be launching a new feature, which is going to directly impact the pipeline. And the enablement team is going to be working on decreasing their ramp time by 1 week. Again, the second this goes to at risk or behind, we know that the SDR team, this is going to impact their pipeline objective. So we're talking a lot about how this relationship mapping leads to proactive insights, which leads us right into our 6th principle, which is dynamic planning is proactive, not reactive. If anyone on the call is taking track of how many times we've said proactive, I'm sure we're up to like 20 by now, but every principle that we've touched on builds up to this. When we align to our strategy, when we build those relationships, when we focus on the outcome, when we prioritize what matters, this is what allows us to have those conversations early and often. When we do this, we can identify where we want to go versus spending all of our time looking in the rearview mirror. What powers the ability for us to have these conversations is by establishing strong rituals. Rituals are something that Abby and I talk about all the time. And what they are the daily practice that allows you to get closer to your goal and monitor your progress along the way. I think the thing I love the most about rituals is why they're very critical when it comes to strategic planning, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Rituals are really key to any goal that we set outside of the workplace. For example, I really like to run, and one day I want to run the Chicago Marathon. So shout out to anyone on this call who might have done that this past month. But we all know that I cannot just show up and run the Chicago Marathon. I could maybe try, but it would never be attainable. My rituals are going to be my patterns and my repetitions that allow me to check in and measure my progress towards my goal to help me know as I'm going through this training plan if I need to pivot or change course. Me not establishing rituals for that would be like showing up to the marathon and hoping for the best without ever checking in and making those incremental gains. And this does not just go for running. This is the same for any goal that you might have, like weightlifting or mastering a new song on the piano or strategic planning. And this is why rituals are so important to set from the onset. We want to create strong objectives, but we have to create a plan to measure progress to help us get there along the way. So let's talk about what these rituals look like so we avoid setting a goal and forgetting to practice. As you can see on the screen, there are 3 key rituals that we walk through as we think about strategic planning. The first ritual is all about how we provide those status updates. So these are objective owners on a weekly basis coming in and saying, hey, is my objective on pace, at risk, or behind? At the same time, updating those key results or measurements. So we're marrying that subjective and objective data. Along with that, and the most important part of this is they are providing context with commentary. So not only are they saying, hey, we're at risk, but here's why. This allows us to gather all of that information, again, short bursts, but more frequent updates, so that we can move to that second ritual of reviewing those. When we talk about reviewing objectives, we are not talking about going through every single objective one by one and seeing where they're at, but having that holistic view to say, great, these are ones that are now on track, but let's focus into the ones that are not improving, or they are now at risk and there's a blocker, so that we as a team can come up with that action and mitigation plan to move us forward. And the third one is all about transitioning those objectives. So as we'll be reviewing them, as we move through those quarters, we're closing out those objectives, we're putting that historical stamp, and we're saying, was this objective a success? Giving it a rating, and once again, providing that context through commentary. All of this is crucial as it allows us to transition to the next quarter and use that momentum to guide us through. When we think about the cadence of these, we talked about this earlier, but those status updates, we strongly recommend weekly, bi-weekly at a minimum with how things change. We want to review those on the exact same cadence. Reviewing the status updates are what reinforces getting the updates in the first place. So again, if we're going in and updating those objectives and we see that nothing is being done with them, our team's going to stop giving us those updates. So making sure that we're reviewing them on the same cadence that we're providing that status update. And then transitioning, this is oftentimes done on a quarterly basis. So these three rituals with this frequency are what allows us to just think ahead, again, be proactive, and ultimately move towards that opportunity.
All right. As we think about the principles that we just walked through, these last two principles are all about really how we take all that and harness it. For us, when we think about dynamic planning, the seventh principle is all about how we take change, it's an inevitable thing, and turn it into opportunity. We talk about embracing change, accepting it and saying, this is part of our planning. We embrace that, and it allows us to build plans that are more durable, reliable, and consistent. If we haven't said it enough, change is inevitable. It just is. We aren't going to affect that. What we can affect is how we react, embrace, and turn that into really our competitive advantage going forward, which we'll talk about in a second. When we think about our current state, I'll look at the side on the left here. This is our employees' realities, right? They have things like the pandemic, economic fluctuations, technology changes, among many other things. That is their reality. Heck, that is honestly our reality, right? This isn't just our employees. This is every single one of us. This is the reality that we're facing. And for us, we need to be able to understand how we take the jumbled mess on the left and say, rather than getting so caught up in that web and so caught up with every change thrown our way, we're going to bake that into our plan to ensure that we have this clear path going forward. As JC said, it's all about understanding where you are going. And if you understand where you're going, then the path to get there can take some twists and turns. That's okay, it's going to, but we're still aligned on that North Star. We're still aligned on, hey, this is the end goals that we're trying to achieve. When we think about dynamic planning, it's all about how we take what is on the left and not get caught up in that, but rather harness that to where we're going. We often will think about when we're making changes, we often think about making kind of micro versus macro changes. And so for us, it's about making the smaller tweaks and the smaller pivots versus these big sweeping changes, which is what inevitably is going to happen if you're not checking in on this more frequently. What we find is that when we're thinking about our teams, these big sweeping changes make it really hard for the team to stay aligned on where you're going. Oftentimes they may be confused on, wait, did we totally change priorities here? Or what about all these things I was working on? Instead, we want to kind of untangle that mess a little bit. We really want to think about how we make smaller pivots throughout. Again, it's about being, as JC said, I'll add number 21 here, it's about being proactive here. And it's about saying, like, yes, we are all living in chaos, but we want to make that more manageable. We want to understand how we focus on the important, not just the urgent, or how we discern when the urgent becomes important. It's not always black and white here. There is sometimes gray. And so this is really what we're referring to here. When we think about taking that change and harnessing it, it's all about how we use dynamic planning to become our competitive advantage. As a business, this is not just about like checking a box. It's about creating an evolving framework that evolves with your business, because your business is not static either. And we want to do that in a way that fuels growth, that harnesses those changes and turns them into those opportunities. But ultimately, we're doing all that so that we can be more well-positioned going into the future. At the end of the day, businesses that not just survive, but thrive in these conditions are the ones that can adapt. They're the ones that take everything that's being thrown at them and say, I see opportunity in this. And I want to be clear, this is not just about being nimble in terms of employee size. We work with companies that are 10 folks, but we have companies that are 50,000 folks that we're working with. And either way, as JC was sharing around the autonomy through clarity, that is relevant no matter how many employees you have. Every organization is able to be nimble. Is there a little bit more process work within a larger organization? Yes, I'm not trying to deny that, but I am saying that if we create this practice of constantly revisiting our North Stars, reviewing our objectives, understanding how we're checking in, and planning in a more dynamic way, we are going to be able to handle all the changes thrown our way in a much more sustainable way, but in a way that ultimately allows us to win out over our competitors. We talk a lot, for those of you, JC and I are Indianapolis based, for those of you who are not, maybe you're going through this as well, but we have a lot of road construction going on here in Indy. I feel like every time we come into the office, we joke about how we had to find a new route. And a lot of times when I think about traditional planning versus strategic planning, I think about what it was like when I used to drive with MapQuest, where I would physically print out directions before I left to go somewhere. And it would like tell me by how many how many miles I needed to go, and then turn left and that sort of thing. And I was constantly looking for street signs, and the moment I missed a sign, I didn't even know I missed it. My directions were useless because I had planned out every step of the way to get there. I missed one, and all of a sudden I was lost, and I had no idea how to backtrack or where I even missed it in the first place. And that is what it's like to deal with traditional planning. You're setting out before you go into motion. You're writing down your plan. And then you are hoping that that is the exact path that you get there. But the reality is when the distractions come up, my new favorite song comes on the radio and I'm not paying attention to the street signs anymore. Those are the priorities that get thrown our way, that all of a sudden we weren't thinking about this and now we are, and we miss out on our opportunities and we don't know where we're at. Like the fact that I no longer use MapQuest, thank goodness. I'm a big Google Maps fan, but whether you're Google Maps, Waze, or Apple Maps, doesn't matter. The reality is the beauty of that technology is that it reacts to where I'm at. So when I miss that turn, or when it foresees a roadblock coming ahead, like every road that seems to be closed in downtown Indy right now, it can tell me alternate paths to get there. And it can tell me how much time it's going to save me or lose me. It can tell me, hey, if you take this path, you'll save more fuel. That is what dynamic planning should do for your business. That is how this becomes the competitive advantage. As we think about the ever-changing market conditions, I mentioned this at the start, and I want to bring this back up. Dynamic planning is a must-have. You cannot be operating out of MapQuest. You need to be on Google Maps. I'm still working on getting my grandma turned over to Google Maps right now, but that is where we have to be as a business. We have to be able to see what's coming. We have to know the roadblocks ahead as they're happening, right? Not when I get to the detour sign, but I need to know ahead of time. We have to be able to say, hey, this didn't go according to plan. I missed a turn. How are we going to evolve going forward? How can we still get to our end destination, even if we're taking a different path than we thought? We have talked through a lot here, and I hope it is clear. This is something we're obviously very, very passionate about. But at the end of the day, this is affecting all of you all. This is affecting how we run our businesses, and that is why we get so excited when we talk about it. For us, dynamic planning is not something that should be this like total overhaul where you're having to like dedicate your entire time for months at a time to transition to dynamic planning. These are small practices that you can put into play on a regular basis. Check where you're at. There may be principles of this that you're already doing really well, and there may be opportunity to say, hey, We are really great at vertical alignment. We set our North Star, we're great there. We struggle a little bit more on the horizontal front. Great. Just focus on that. It's not about trying to drink from the fire hose. It's about taking these measurable and small steps to get there. We have a lot of resources available here. So I'll flash this up on the screen, but you can head to our website at goelate.com. There's a whole dynamic planning section there. Might as well be our website. Fully, it's all around the manifesto, everything that we've talked through here. It's around a playbook. So we've got a lot of resources available there in terms of how do we put this into motion. It's got a lot of slides similar to what you saw today. You can adapt and change. And then lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, we obviously have not just our software, but our strategic services arm as well. We come alongside businesses, understand where they're at, and then help them get where they want to go. For us, it's all about how we can be an outside kind of third-party resource here to say, hey, this is what we're seeing. This is what we hear from you on where you want to go. Let us help you navigate that path. So if you have any interest in any of those, please let us know. You can, again, head to our website, get in contact with us there, but you can access that manifesto and playbook on your own. All right. I know we just saved a couple minutes here. I'll wrap things up just to leave a little bit of time for questions. I know some of you might need to get to 3 o'clock meetings, so no worries if you need to hop off, but we'll stay on just a minute or two to see if there are questions. Feel free to put those in the chat. Otherwise, we just want to say thank you so much for spending an hour of your day with us. We recognize that everyone is very busy right now, especially our strategy and operations leaders and anyone going through the planning process right now. So we really appreciate it. Again, we will be sending out the recording for this afterwards. So if you are listening to the recording here and you have questions, get in contact with us. Our emails are on this page, and then you can always reach out to us on our website as well. We would love to chat. We hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to connecting with you all further.